welcome back. And we are moving into our first conversation this morning with Ambassador Janine Coye Felson. She is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Belize to the United Nations. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Ambassador, one of the things that we will be talking about is a high-level review that takes place next week. But having you here on set, it gives us an opportunity to talk about our own representatives outside of Belize and some of the work that you have been doing. And being specifically assigned to the UN Office for Belize, that means you have quite a task on your hand as well. So let's start there to set the backdrop.
Right. Yeah. So the Permanent Mission of Belize to the United Nations has been there since our independence, basically. Yes. And you're right, the UN agenda has expanded its breadth over the years. So what we started off in 1981 looks like nothing in 2018. And what we've been challenged to do is basically to focus on our strategic interests. And of course, for Belize, like many of the Caribbean countries, our focus is on sustainable development. So we've been very active in the development of the more recent Sustainable Development Agenda, called the 2030 Agenda, and we're very active in promoting the interests, the very specific interests of countries like our own. We're a low-lying coastal state, but we share very much characteristics with small island developing states. So we advance those specific interests within the Sustainable Development Agenda. One of those, of course, is in respect of climate change. Yes. Now in New York, we don't negotiate climate change, but I happen to be a lead negotiator on climate finance for all the small island developing states. So through our office, we do coordination for negotiations that occur around the world, basically, largely in Germany, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is located, but also wherever the climate change meetings are hosted. So it's basically to identify our strategic interest in a very big global agenda. And for us, development is key.
Developing partnerships as well, as you've mentioned, in working with other countries or islands in the Caribbean that have a similar interest, obviously works to our benefit. And when we go back to the Paris Agreement, we know how instrumental the Caribbean was in being able to get certain targets in place. Now, climate change has been a conversation we've been having in Belize for a long time because we know where we get our resources, whether it's from tourism, for the natural resources that we have, or even from fishing or agriculture. How has the conversation changed now that it seems to be a broader global conversation where there are people who are still vehemently against some of the proposals, but there are many more who are looking at what can be done to mitigate the potential damage of climate change?
Right. I think with the Paris Agreement, what was demonstrably different from the conversation prior to that was that we were very focused on a top-down approach. And with the Paris Agreement, we tried to merge that top-down with a bottom-up approach. So what you have in Paris isn't something that's very prescriptive as to what countries are supposed to do, but it does create the platform for countries to bring to the table what they can do. And I think also it engages the private and other sectors of the society to also encourage them to put forward their own actions. I think that's a really big change. And so you're right, there are specific countries that have vehemently opposed now, for whatever reasons, the Paris Agreement, but there are so many more, and so many more is not necessarily just in terms of government, because there are overwhelming majority of governments who are still committed to the Paris Agreement. But when you look into some of those very countries who have issues with the Paris Agreement, if you look at the subnational level, you will see quite a bit of activity and commitment to pursuing the Paris Agreement goals. So I think that's really what changed, is bringing others into the conversation from the bottom up and not just top down.
You spoke of your role specifically being a negotiator for climate financing, and this is where we could potentially have the greatest benefit. You know, I think it's largely understood now that where the countries that are contributing towards climate change aren't the ones that are suffering the most consequences. it's a difficult, I mean, I'd imagine it's a difficult scenario to manage, because if you're not seeing the direct effects in your own backyard, then being able to understand why you need to help a country across the ocean or assist them in whether it's, you know, trying to help them maintain their coral reefs or whatever it is, isn't always an easy sell. What is it like now?
Right. So there is, prior to the Paris Agreement, we had what was called the Framework Convention, which is, again, something that even for small island developing states, we can certainly take some credit for, because we pushed for that Framework Convention. And in that Framework Convention, we already created a legal commitment for countries that are major emitters to contribute to the most vulnerable, or what we call particularly vulnerable countries, such as small island developing states. So we've had that as a basis upon which we've been pursuing our interests. And really the conversation now in finance has been, how do we balance the focus on mitigation, which is on greenhouse gas emissions, which we have very negligible contributions to adaptation finance, the very thing that you mentioned. How do we convince others to pay for the damages that are occurring in our countries? Or how do we convince them that it's worth investing in greener infrastructure? And that is a very challenging conversation. We've been trying to look at how we can create value along the adaptation chain. So you can look at examples around the world of countries like Seychelles that have been floating blue bonds, or look into the blue economy as a way to change the conversation from looking at adaptation as just a giveaway versus something that is an investment opportunity. So that type of conversation is what we're having. And yes, it still continues to be challenging. Adaptation finance is way below what mitigation finance is. I think it's somewhere around 20% of overall financing that comes through for climate change, which is really low when you think of the extent of damages. Look at Dominica, it experienced something like 200% of its GDP loss to Hurricane Maria. So these things are definitely important topics, but it's trying to shift the conversation again to look more at the opportunities for investing in infrastructure that is resilient to climate change.
And a part of what is going to be taking place leading up to the review on the SAMOA pathway is talking about what is called the law of the oceans?
Law of the sea.
Law of the seas. Tell us about that and where it was birthed.
Right. So the law of the sea is something that in the Caribbean we're very proud of. It was the first framework convention, comprehensive framework convention, because there were predecessors to it. That set out basically how we will manage our waters within jurisdiction. So in Montego Bay in 1982, they adopted this convention, and it has endured up until this point, which is tremendous. I think Belize can also feel proud, because we were one of the countries with one of the first judges to be on the Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, Eddie Lang. You know, we have this building dedicated to him. He was a great jurist, and I think something we should be proud of as well. But we contributed significantly to the development of this convention. And now we're looking at the last frontier in the law of the sea, which is the areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's common space. It covers something like 64% of all our oceans. It's a very significant space in terms of marine biodiversity, shipping, fisheries, you name it, it's important to us. It's, you know, the oceans themselves are considered a life support system, but we're basically depleting our fish stocks. We're polluting our seas and our oceans, and all of this is impacting on marine biological diversity. So now we have advocated, the Caribbean, along with the Pacific small islands and others in the African, Indian, Mediterranean areas, have advocated for a new treaty that would look at how we can better comprehensively govern what we call the high seas, but it's basically anything outside of national jurisdiction.
Waters,
And that's something that we're only in the beginning, in the early stages of, but we need to bring our own interests onto the table to sort of set the framework that would best benefit us. And this workshop that we're going to have today, tomorrow and Wednesday, will help Caribbean negotiators prepare themselves for that intergovernmental conference that will negotiate it. It won't happen overnight. It won't happen in 2 weeks. It won't happen in 2 years. We've already scheduled 3 years of negotiations, so we know it's a long haul. And it's going to be very important for us to start training others. I mean, I'm not always going to be there. So we're trying to build a capacity in the region to start speaking to the issues intelligently.
When you talk about the longevity from 1982 to now, we don't hear or talk very much about the law of the seas. Talk to us about some of the areas where, having had that treaty put in place, that we've seen benefits, whether for us locally or in this region.
Well, the law of the sea is what determines our borders in the sea. So that is tremendous. We all know the whole discussion about the 12-mile limit for territorial waters, and we've advocated vigorously for ensuring that that continues to be maintained and observed. Beyond that, we have the 200 nautical miles from our baselines, which extends outwards to our exclusive economic zone, and that's all for the purposes of fisheries. And what's been significant for Belize is that because we've been able to manage our waters, we've instituted a series of marine protected areas to ensure that our fisheries are sustainable. And I'm impressed. I mean, I'm not certainly the expert in the fisheries area, but we had several fisher folks visit the UN last year for the Ocean Conference. And it was with, again, tremendous pride that I listened to fisherwomen and fishermen speak about how they are contributing to the management of this important resource, not only for our sustainable livelihood in Belize, but also that helps with our export industries. So we've benefited from that type of framework. So under the law of the sea, we've seen other offshoots. We have the Fisheries Convention, which is called the Fisheries Fish Stocks Agreement. And then we have another agreement which manages another space that's way beyond our borders, but we call it the Common Heritage of Mankind, which is the seabed in the deep sea beyond areas within national jurisdiction that houses mineral resources for exploitation, and we're managing that through another body called the International Seabed Authority. So we have had benefits, whether for fisheries, for our own border and sovereignty and integrity, as well as for managing other aspects of our marine biological diversity in the Caribbean.
And moving into the consultations that start today, who's going to be involved?
So we've brought in negotiators from New York and negotiators from the Caribbean. They're all Caribbean negotiators. Together with myself, I have a colleague from Barbados who's a co-lead negotiator on areas beyond national jurisdiction treaty, and a deputy representative from Jamaica. I think we have a very good representation. We're also bringing in experts from the University of West Indies, and we're trying to build up a new type of stakeholder engagement. So it would be great if we can get stakeholders from Belize involved to start seeing how we can identify other types of regional interests. So we're using Canary. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called the Caribbean Natural Resource Institute, based out of Trinidad and Tobago. And then, of course, we have sponsors, the Pew Charitable Trust, High Seas Alliance, and Islands First. And they've brought in their international experts as well. So it's a very comprehensive, a well-run workshop, I think.
And what are some of the immediate priority areas that you would foresee would be brought forward in this consultation? Because if we look at high seas specifically, because of where we're located, we're fairly protected. But our Caribbean brothers and sisters who have the ocean on the other side, they obviously have different threats.
So there are several issues that we're dealing with directly. One is we're looking at marine genetic resources and research that's being done in the high seas in that area. And because we consider the high seas a public good, a common space, we're arguing against any type of appropriation of that type of information, knowledge that we can use to better understand what are human impacts on the ocean and how that might have downstream impacts on our own seas and resources. We're also looking at marine protected areas, or what we will call more generally area-based management tools that will help with fisheries and maintaining fish stocks. Again, you're right, we don't necessarily have access to the high seas, but Belize, as well as several of our other Caribbean countries, have we're considered flag states, so we do have distant fishing fleets, and we need to be sure that what we're doing in terms of management of those will be consistent with our objectives of ensuring the sustainability of fisheries. And then we're also looking at environmental impact assessments as another way of protecting the marine biological diversity in the areas outside of national jurisdiction, so that we can ensure that activities that occur there won't damage ecosystems that exist that are vulnerable already. So those are some of the areas that we're looking at.
Okay. So that's one of the activities that's ongoing, and we are looking also forward to next week, where you'll be having a midterm review for what's called the SAMOA pathway. Now we need to simplify this for everyone, and I think it is a review leading. Well, for the Caribbean, leading into a larger review that takes place next year, right? And it's specifically for small islands developing states. So Belize falls within that category, these small developing countries within the Caribbean that many see as less advantaged than the more developed countries. Talk to us about what the original intention was of the SAMOA pathway before we talk about what we'll see in the review.
Right. So I actually want, I'm glad you raised that point about trying to break it down, because I was struggling myself to think about, well, why is anybody going to be interested in this? And they should be. I think we can go back all the way to 1989, when a group of small countries decided, you know what, we're on the front lines of something huge. Climate change is on the agenda, sea level rise is on the agenda. They were already looking at the law of the sea, how that was going to be impacting our countries, and they said, we have to do something. So these countries all came together. Belize eventually joined them to form something called the Alliance of Small Island States. They advocated in 1992 at the first Earth Summit in Rio to have these countries recognized as a special case for sustainable development. We got an agreement by then to have a first SIDS, Small Island Developing States Conference in Barbados. And that's where everything started. I mean, this is very much linked to what we did with the Law of the Sea, where the Law of the Sea Framework Convention was basically birthed in the Caribbean. So was the agenda for Small Island Developing States. And we put there why it is that we need international support for our countries, because we're small, we're geographically remote, we're spread around, we have endemic characteristics that make it hard for us to basically develop on our own without international support. And then we've seen increasing impacts from climate change that are really pushing us to the limits of our capacity to use our own resources to adapt. And we're saying, listen, more than ever, we need something to be done now. SAMOA, the way these outcome documents get their names is you happen to have the conference in your country, and that's where it comes, right? So we'll have, we had the SAMOA pathway in 2014, which basically reinvigorated the Small Island Developing States agenda to bring more focus on partnerships with Small Island Developing States. It gave way to some 300 partnerships, but sadly the Caribbean didn't benefit as much from that. And perhaps it is because we didn't do the correct branding for the SAMOA pathway to make it more our own. And I think this is our opportunity to change that, to say, listen, hey, we are basically the cradle of this agenda. We have these significant challenges, and one of the things that we're going to be talking a lot about will be resilience, not only from the climate change perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because they're very much interrelated. And we'll be looking at access to finance, looking at how we can create a better enabling environment internationally to help us access the type of support we need, not only through traditional development partners, but perhaps private sector or a combination of private and public sector financing.
What's unique about SIDS, or Small Island Developing States, is it really is a great example of where those who are most vulnerable are really advocating on their own behalf. When we talk about the Caribbean, now if someone is to think of a Trinidad, well, I can't say Barbados, Jamaica, the development level is very different, especially if we look at home. one would argue that oftentimes if you are not a powerhouse, then you have less of a voice. And, you know, perhaps you're less listened to. There's less interest in partnership or even being able to attract different funding. How have you seen it from your end as a negotiator and working out within your own respective office?
Yeah, well, definitely we've basically learned from experience that when we come together and we speak with one voice, we tend to get heard more clearly and more, and people will respond. But there is always going to be the challenge of, well, how does a Belize go out, strike out on its own to get the attention that it needs? And I think, hey, this is again one of the wonderful opportunities that we have right now with the meeting that's going to occur in San Pedro, because we get to actually showcase what we've been doing. And Belize has done a lot that we simply don't publicize. You know, we're not that PR type of a country that gets out there and says, you know, hey, this is what we've done. But one example of doing that and getting results is actually with what happened in the Ocean Conference, where Belize showcased many of its initiatives with respect to protecting its natural resources. And from that, we were invited to participate in a project, a pilot project, with one of the UN entities, and that's something very positive. So there is a lot to gain from basically just showcasing what you've done. And that's part of my job, right? As a diplomat, I'm supposed to collect information from Belize and share it with the rest of the international community and identify areas where here we can connect the local to the global. That's important, but it's not ever going to be easy. And moving into the review at this point, and there've been separate reviews taking place. We'll be hosting the Caribbean review. You mentioned earlier that perhaps we have not benefited as much as was the first intention in 2014. So where do you feel that we perhaps have missed opportunities, and why is that so? So I think with the Samoa, so the Samoa pathway came out just at the same time as the 2030 agenda, and a lot of the UN focus sort of shifted to the 2030 agenda. And I know that in Belize we benefited from a pilot project for integrating the Sustainable Development Goals into our growth and sustainable development strategy. And so I think institutionally, there was that shift in focus on 2030 agenda, and that sort of crowded out the space of focus for the Samoa pathway. With the partnerships, I think that's just a matter of circumstances. Samoa pathway occurred in the Pacific, so of course it generated a lot of attention in partnerships in the Pacific, and the Pacific has been very active in pursuing those. We've probably taken a very slightly different approach to partnerships. In the Caribbean, we focus largely on international development cooperation, less so on, you know, partnerships with NGOs and things of that nature. But those still exist, and we need to harness those and fit them into something that's more SID specific. So I think we have the opportunity to do that now.
Very clearly, the pathway speaks of partnership versus receiving funding, grants, or even, as you mentioned, development corporations. What's the difference?
It's a fine line. I think the main point, at least from a negotiator standpoint, is that we don't ever want to avoid the conversation that developed countries have committed to 0.7% of their GNI or GDP to development cooperation, and that needs to be maintained. So everything partnership would basically be additional to that commitment, and that's really, I guess, the best way to say what's the difference that we see between
that partnership there's a responsibility in addition. And you spoke even of working with NGOs as well as a part of this partnership. Now let's shift back to the Pacific, because then maybe if we see what others are able to achieve, we can see where we would be able to achieve. What are some of the great examples coming out from there?
So in Seychelles is perhaps one of the better examples. They have worked with, I don't remember the name of the Leonardo DiCaprio Association or organization. I think they've worked with them to deal with their debt for adaptation swap. So Seychelles has been one. In the Pacific, there's also the it's called GLIPSA, and now I don't remember the meaning of the acronym, but it's basically an ocean NGO that has advocated for different areas of building capacity. It's not always just money. Technology transfer again, that's a lot. Seychelles ambassador in New York became a spokesperson for them, and that was a way for generating a lot of interest around that. And then there are other smaller projects that they've developed. Some of them are, not big name NGOs, but more locally source NGOs that they've been working with. But a lot of it has been focused on oceans, and without a doubt, that's significant. The Pacific and even some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, they consider themselves large ocean states, not small island developing states, because they have vast amounts of ocean within their jurisdiction that they have to manage. So it's things of that nature that have been really a success pattern for them.
So taking that all into consideration, when the Caribbean representatives get together next week, you'll be doing kind of like your preparatory work for the bigger review. What are you hoping to get out of this process? What's the goal?
So what we're going to try to focus on is, so SAMOA Pathway has a number of thematic focus areas, and because we have these other competing international agendas, we really need to zero in on and sharpen our policy focus on what particularly within these areas we will have to focus on in the next 5 years and make significant progress on. So we're going to be looking at strategizing, at prioritization of areas of focus. As I mentioned, resilience will be a very strong theme in there, so we'll see that coming out. And then we'll try to identify actions that we expect from the international community, actions that we ourselves will be ready to commit to. We're hoping to have a San Pedro declaration, so we'll have our own name, so we don't have to just refer to SAMOA Pathway anymore. And in that, then we will list out those areas of priority and areas of action that will then feed into an interregional process, which will happen in Samoa in October. And then we'll come out with a draft negotiating text that we'll take forward through 2019 and eventually adopted at the high-level conference in September of 2019.
Now, the midterm review seems to be almost acknowledging that perhaps the progress hasn't been made that was first set out. Why do you think the focus is now on being able to get the small islands to come together and almost set out your own demands list of sorts, prioritizing areas that whether it be resilience, capacity building, or focusing on oceans?
So truthfully, the midterm review is sort of a cyclical process. So after Barbados, we had a midterm review. It's to keep your hands on the pulse to see that things are moving. And so this midterm review is consistent with that type of process. We are trying to now refocus, basically. We bring back the spotlight onto Samoa because it has lost some of that in the frenzy of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and things of that nature. So it's not so much that it's happening because it's not been implemented. It's part of the cycle, and we're necessarily going to have to look at what it is that we take from now through to 2024 to make sure that we've achieved something from the Samoa Pathway for our own benefits. And we don't want to lose the SIDS agenda. So the 2024 mark is not only the end of Samoa Pathway, but we hope will be yet again another opportunity to redefine where we're going as small island development states in the international agenda.
Now, the most important question in this conversation, it really has to be with bringing it home. High-level meetings like this take place very regularly, and I think we aren't always able to tie it back to what it means for an everyday Belizean, whether you're working in a onshore or offshore. Talk to us about where you see potential for benefits for Belizeans.
For Belize, because I happen to come from more of the finance perspective, and given our own issues with economic resilience and financial resilience, we're looking at how exactly we can ease the access opportunities for Belize, and that will be something that will have more of a trickle-down effect to the local level. In adaptation finance in particular, though, we've always been looking at how we can have subnational entities gain access to finance directly, rather than having to go through hoops and other multilateral entities, for instance. Because we know that adaptation works best when it's local. So it's not something that is tangible, that we can say, here, I'm giving you, X amount of dollars for you to do this. But what we're going to be doing is creating the opportunity that you define what you need, and then you're able to approach whatever entity for financing that you can then use for developing whatever projects or initiatives, or pursuing whatever initiatives will be necessary. There are other areas that we can look to, for instance, with renewable energy. We've already seen some benefits through one of our partners, through the UAE. They've been working with Belize to pilot some projects with respect to renewable energy, solar energy in particular, and that will be something that they're trying to look at, those communities that don't have access to energy. That's perhaps something more tangible, but again, it's creating that opportunity that then we can connect our local population, their needs, to what's available at the international level.
Keeping the doors open.
Exactly.
And what are we hearing so far from our technical persons, and what will be the priorities that we'll be putting forward?
So for the Caribbean, we focused a lot on climate change resilience, and that, I mean, it's driven largely from what has occurred last year. So we're going to be looking a lot at the climate change issues. We're looking at debt sustainability, a huge issue for the Caribbean. You know that many countries are way beyond 60% of GDP, debt to GDP ratios, so it's very significant for the Caribbean. It's very frightening when you think we're heading into the hurricane, we're in the hurricane season, and we're constantly in this mode of rebuilding. So any type of economic growth is not sustainable because it's volatile. We're basically growing to rebuild, essentially. We're going to be looking at non-communicable diseases, again, a huge issue for the Caribbean. And we're looking at how we can better strategize on NCD's issues. There is a platform for discussion on that. We're going to try to look at synergies there. And then for the Caribbean, we're also looking at citizen security issues, citizen security related issues, small arms being a big issue, transnational organized crime. I think throughout the region, we're seeing problems that are from the levels of crime that exist, that are impacting socially and economically our citizens. So these are some of the areas that we're probably going to be focusing on. And of course, we'll always be speaking to the issues of capacity building, transfer of technology, and things of that nature.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming in and sharing with us the work that is ongoing and what will be taking place in our own neck of the woods.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be focusing on the Mercy Clinic and some of the changes that are taking place there. So stay tuned.